What if the one person you trusted to protect your children was the very person they needed protection from? David Anderson, a powerful CEO, believed his children were safe with their loving aunt after his wife's tragic death. He provided everything for them from a distance, a beautiful home, the best of everything, while he buried his grief in his work. But a sudden, gut-wrenching feeling makes him cut a business trip short and fly home unexpectedly. He doesn't find a warm welcome. He finds a home filled with an eerie, perfect silence, and his little girl frozen in fear. When he asks her what's wrong, his eyes fall on a tiny, chipped wooden sparrow, a seemingly innocent detail that will expose a horrifying secret and ignite a father's desperate fight to save his family. David Anderson's world was a fortress of glass and steel, 40 stories above the city streets. From his corner office, the world was a neat grid of lights and shadows, an orderly landscape he could understand. His desk was a testament to his life's philosophy. A single, perfectly sharpened pencil lay parallel to a stack of architectural plans. Not a speck of dust marred the polished mahogany, and the faint, clean scent of paper and ink was the only perfume he allowed. At 42, David had built an empire from blueprints and ambition. He designed buildings that scraped the sky, structures that were strong, flawless, and predictable. Everything in its place. Everything under control. It was this control that had saved him, or so he told himself. It had been the scaffolding that held him up 2 years ago when his world had crumbled. Before, his life wasn't made of steel and glass, but of laughter, the scent of baking bread, and the soft touch of Lena's hand in his. Lena was the sun, and he had simply been a planet caught in her warm, brilliant orbit. Their home, a sprawling house with a garden she adored, was always filled with light and the happy chaos of their daughter Lily, who would chase butterflies on the lawn, her dark curls bouncing like springs. Then came Leo, their son, a beautiful, perfect baby. But his arrival was shrouded in sorrow, as it marked Lena's departure. A complication, the doctors called it, a cruel, random twist of fate that stole the architect of their joy and left David with the blueprints of a life he no longer knew how to build. He had retreated into the one thing that still made sense, his work. The long hours, the demanding projects, the business trips that took him across continents, they were his refuge. He built towers for others because he didn't know how to rebuild his own home. A gentle chime from his computer reminded him it was time. He had a flight to catch, a week-long conference in London. He packed his leather briefcase with the same precision he used to design a skyscraper's foundation, his movements economical and sure. Before leaving, he picked up the silver-framed photo on his desk. It was of Lena and a 5-year-old Lily, their faces pressed together, both beaming with a light that felt a million miles away now. He traced the curve of Lena's smile with his thumb, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. He missed her with a physical force that still, after 2 years, could steal his breath. He put the photo down and dialed home. "Anderson residence," a warm, melodic voice answered. "Isabella." "It's me," David said, his own voice sounding hollow in comparison. "Just calling to say I'm heading out soon." "Oh, darling, of course," she said. Her tone was always so perfectly pitched, a soothing balm on his raw nerves. "Everything here is just fine. Lily is finishing her drawing, and Leo just had his bottle. Not a peep out of him." Isabella was Lena's cousin. After the funeral,
When David was drowning in grief and the overwhelming reality of raising 2 children alone, she had appeared like a miracle. She'd moved into the guest room, seamlessly taking over the household, her quiet competence a stark contrast to his spiraling despair. She managed the meals, the children's schedules, and the quiet hum of the house with an effortless grace that David was endlessly grateful for. He saw her as a guardian of Lena's legacy, a loving presence ensuring his children had the stability he couldn't provide. "I should be back next Friday," he said, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on. "Mrs. Gable is still coming on her usual days?" "Of course, David. She's a treasure. Don't you worry about a thing. We have it all under control here. You just focus on your work. We're all so proud of you." He hung up, a wave of gratitude washing over him. He was a lucky man. What would he have done without her? He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, deciding to make a quick stop at home before heading to the airport. He wanted to kiss his children goodbye. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked as serene as ever, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Inside, the silence was immaculate. The usual clutter of a home with children, a stray toy, a pair of tiny shoes kicked off in the hall, was gone. Everything was tidy, polished, and in its place. It felt more like one of his architectural models than a home. Isabella met him at the door, a welcoming smile on her face. She was beautiful, always perfectly dressed, her dark hair pulled back in a chic knot. "David, what a lovely surprise! I thought you were going straight to the airport." "Just wanted to see them before I left," he said, his eyes scanning the living room. Lily and Leo were on a soft rug in the center of the room. Leo was sleeping soundly in a bassinet, and Lily was sitting perfectly still, a coloring book open on her lap, though her crown wasn't moving. She looked up when she heard his voice, but the usual joyful spark in her eyes was missing. It was a muted, watchful expression. "Daddy," she said, her voice small. He knelt beside her, his heart clenching. She was so much like Lena, with the same deep brown eyes and delicate features. He hugged her, breathing in the faint, sweet scent of her hair. "Hey, my sweet girl, I'm going to miss you." She hugged him back tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck with a desperate strength. She didn't say anything, just held on. He pulled back and smoothed her hair. "You be good for Auntie Isabella, okay?" She nodded, her gaze flickering for a split second towards the kitchen, where Isabella was now preparing a tray of tea. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance, but it pricked at the edge of David's awareness. His eyes fell to the small table beside her. On it sat a collection of her favorite things, little treasures she had collected. Among them was the small wooden sparrow Lena had carved for her years ago. It was Lily's most prized possession, a tangible link to her mother. She handled it with the reverence of a holy relic, always keeping it on a soft cloth to protect it. But something was wrong.
A tiny, jagged chip was missing from the tip of the sparrow's wing. It was small, but on the otherwise smooth, well-loved wood, it stood out like a scar. "Lily, honey, what happened to your sparrow?" he asked gently, picking it up. He saw it then, a flash of pure fear in her eyes, so quick he almost missed it. Her body tensed, and her hands clenched in her lap. She wouldn't meet his gaze. I dropped it, Daddy," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on the rug. "It fell. It was an accident." Her voice was flat, rehearsed. It didn't sound like the truth. It didn't sound like his Lily. A strange, cold feeling twisted in David's gut. He looked from the chipped bird to his daughter's averted face. He wanted to press her, to ask again. But his phone buzzed in his pocket. A reminder. The flight. "Oh, honey, we have to be more careful," he said, his mind already shifting to traffic and boarding times. He placed the sparrow back on the table and kissed the top of her head. "I have to go now. I love you." "I love you too, Daddy," she whispered, but she didn't look up. Isabella walked him to the door, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Have a safe flight, David. We'll be right here when you get back." As he drove away, the image of the chipped sparrow and the fear in Lily's eyes lingered. It was a discordant note in the perfectly composed symphony of his life. For a moment, he considered turning the car around, canceling the trip, staying home to unravel this small, unsettling mystery. But he dismissed it as quickly as it came. He was tired, and she was just a child. Kids drop things. It was nothing. He accelerated onto the highway, the lights of the city blurring into streaks of gold and white. He had a conference to lead, a project to oversee. His children were safe. They were with Isabella. They were fine. The fortress of his well-ordered life remained intact, and he refused to see the cracks that were beginning to form in its foundation. The first few days in London were a blur of handshakes, meetings, and the polite, muted applause of industry peers. David moved through the motions with practiced ease, his mind sharp and his presentations flawless. His hotel room overlooked the Thames, the river a dark, snaking ribbon through a city of ancient stone and modern glass. It was the kind of view that usually inspired him, a panorama of human achievement. But this time, the grandeur felt hollow. The architectural marvels outside his window, nothing more than cold, inanimate objects. His thoughts kept drifting back to the small wooden sparrow on Lily's table. It was just a chip, a tiny, insignificant flaw. He told himself this a dozen times a day. Children were clumsy. Lily, especially, was a whirlwind of energy, always running, jumping, and exploring. Of course she'd drop things. It was perfectly logical. And yet the logic did nothing to soothe the unease that had settled in his chest, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of his carefully constructed composure. It wasn't the chip itself that bothered him. It was the look in Lily's eyes when he'd asked about it, the flicker of fear, the way her small shoulders had tensed, the quick, rehearsed answer that felt utterly foreign coming from his daughter. He called home each evening at precisely 7 o'clock London time, just after the children's dinner. Isabella always answered on the second ring, her voice a smooth, reassuring melody. "Everything is wonderful, David," she'd say. "Leo is giggling in his playpen, and Lily has just finished the most beautiful picture of a castle for you." The first night he asked to speak with Lily. There was a pause, a muffled sound, and then his daughter's small voice came on the line. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, sweet girl. Are you having fun with Auntie Isabella?" "Yes, Daddy." "Did you eat all your dinner?" "Yes, Daddy." Her answers were clipped, dutiful. The usual stream of chatter about her day at school, the ladybug she had found in the garden, the funny face Leo had made, was absent. He could feel the distance across the thousands of miles of ocean and land, a silence that was more telling than any words.
"Is everything okay, Lilybug?" he asked. The nickname Lena had given her slipping out, feeling strange and precious on his tongue. Another pause. "Yes, Daddy. I have to go now. Auntie Isabella says it's bath time." Before he could say "I love you," the phone was passed back to Isabella. "See? Right as rain," she chirped. "She's just a little tired. She misses you terribly, of course." He hung up, the feeling of unease sharpening into a splinter of genuine worry. He tried to brush it off. He was overthinking. Grief had a way of making a man see shadows where there were none. The next day, he took a break from the conference to walk through Hyde Park.
The crisp autumn air was a welcome change from the stuffy conference halls. He watched his family strolled along the paths, parents pushing strollers, children laughing as they chased pigeons. He saw a father with a little girl on his shoulders, her dark hair a tangle of happy curls, much like Lily's. The man was whispering something in her ear, and she was shrieking with delight. David felt a pang so sharp it was like a physical blow. He had become a stranger in his own children's lives, a visitor who appeared for brief, scheduled intervals before disappearing again into his world of work. He was providing for them, giving them everything money could buy, but he was absent from the small, everyday moments that truly mattered. That night, his call home felt different. He was no longer just checking in. He was searching for something, a clue he couldn't name. Isabella answered, her voice as smooth as ever. "We had a marvelous day," she announced. "We went to the library, and then we baked cookies." "That sounds nice," David said, his grip tightening on the phone. "Is Lily there?" "She's just getting ready for bed. Let me see if I can catch her." He waited, listening to the silence on the other end of the line. This time, he thought he heard something else, a faint, sharp sound, like a gasp, quickly stifled. Then a door closing softly. When Isabella came back on the line, her voice was a fraction too bright. "Oh, you just missed her, David. She was so sleepy she could barely keep her eyes open, tucked in and dreaming already." A lie. He knew it, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was a lie. Lily was an owl, just like her mother. She fought sleep with a fierce determination, always pleading for one more story, one more song. "Isabella," he said, keeping his voice level, "about Lily's sparrow. Did you find a way to fix it?" "The sparrow? Oh, that old thing. Yes, a little dab of wood glue and it's good as new. You can't even tell. Silly girl was so upset about it, but I told her not to bother her busy daddy with such a little thing." The cold feeling in his stomach turned to ice. A chip couldn't be glued back on. It would leave a seam, a scar. Isabella wasn't just placating him, she was actively hiding something. Why would she lie about something so small, unless it wasn't small at all? He ended the call politely, his mind racing. He walked to the window and stared out at the city, but he wasn't seeing the lights of London. He was seeing Lily's face, her eyes wide with a fear she was trying to hide. He saw the empty, polished perfection of his home, a place scrubbed clean of life and joy, and the chipped wing of the little wooden bird.
He closed his eyes, and a memory, vivid and painful, surfaced. It was the day Lena had given Lily the sparrow. They were in the garden, the sun warm on their faces. Lena had pressed the small bird into Lily's palm. "This little bird is strong, Lilybug," she had said, her voice full of love. "It can fly through any storm, but even the strongest things need to be held gently. You have to protect it always." The words echoed in David's mind, a promise he had failed to understand, a promise he had broken. He hadn't been there to hold them gently. He had left them in a storm. His fortress of glass and steel suddenly felt like the most fragile thing in the world. With shaking hands, he opened his laptop. He ignored the emails from his associates, the glowing reviews of his keynote address, the entire life he had so meticulously built to protect himself from pain. He clicked on the airline's website. He wasn't looking for a return flight for next Friday. He was looking for the first flight home. He found one, leaving in 3 hours. He booked it without a second thought,
a surge of adrenaline cutting through his exhaustion. He was coming home, and this time he wouldn't be leaving. The flight across the Atlantic was a long, sleepless torment. David, a man who could sleep soundly through turbulence and time zones, found himself staring out the small oval window into an endless expanse of inky blackness. The quiet hum of the engines was a maddening drone that did nothing to drown out the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He was a man of facts and figures, of blueprints where every line had a purpose and every angle was precise. But there were no blueprints for the feeling that was now consuming him, a cold, sickening dread that defied all logic. He replayed the conversations in his head, searching for clues he had missed. Isabella's voice, always so smooth and reassuring, now sounded like a carefully constructed facade. Silly girl was so upset, I told her not to bother her busy daddy. The words, meant to be comforting, now felt like a subtle act of isolation, a wall being built between him and his children, brick by polite, well-meaning brick. He thought of Lily's stilted replies on the phone, the absence of her usual bright chatter. He had told himself it was tiredness, that she missed him. But what if it was fear? What if the silence on the other end of the line was not the peaceful quiet of a well-run home, but the enforced silence of children who had learned that making noise was dangerous?
He sat in his car across the street, watching the schoolyard fill with the noisy, joyful chaos of morning drop-off. He saw mothers kissing scraped knees, fathers adjusting backpacks, the easy, casual affection of a world he had all but forgotten. When he finally saw Mrs. Gable, the kind, elderly woman who helped Isabella a few days a week, leading Lily by the hand, his heart leaped. He got out of the car and called her name, "Lily!" Her head snapped up, and for a moment her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Then her eyes darted nervously toward Mrs. Gable, who looked just as surprised to see him. "Mr. Anderson!" Mrs. Gable exclaimed, her hand tightening on Lily's. "We weren't expecting you. Isabella said you were away for the week." "My plans changed," David said, his eyes locked on his daughter. "Can I have a word with Lily, please?" Lily hadn't moved. She stood frozen, her small hand clutching the strap of her pink backpack, her knuckles white. She looked like a frightened deer, poised to bolt. Mrs. Gable gave him a concerned look, but nodded, gently nudging Lily forward. David knelt on the pavement, ignoring the press of his expensive suit against the rough concrete. "Hey, sweet girl, I came home early. I missed you too much." He opened his arms, but she didn't run into them. She took a hesitant step, then another, her eyes wide and searching his face. When she was close enough, she spoke in a whisper so faint he had to lean in to hear it. "Is Auntie Isabella with you?" The question was a punch to the gut. "No, honey, it's just me." Relief washed over her face, so potent it was like watching the sun break through clouds. And then she collapsed into his arms, not with the happy abandon of a child greeting her father, but with the desperate, clinging force of a shipwreck survivor reaching for a life raft. She buried her face in his shoulder, and her small body began to shake with silent, racking sobs. Hey, what is it?" he murmured, stroking her hair. "What's wrong, Lilybug? You can tell me." She just shook her head, her sobs muffled against his shirt. He looked up at Mrs. Gable, whose face was etched with worry and something else. Guilt? "Mr. Anderson," she began, her voice low, I think you should come home. There are things
Things aren't quite right." David's blood ran cold. "What things, Mrs. Gable? What's been happening in my house?" The elderly woman wrung her hands, her gaze dropping to the ground. "Isabella, she has rules, very strict rules, about noise and food. She says it's for their own good, to teach them discipline since their mother isn't here to... But the children, they seem so sad, so quiet. It's not natural, sir." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture so monstrous David could barely look at it. The silence, the fear, the chipped sparrow. It wasn't an accident. It was a punishment. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable." His voice was a low growl. He stood up, lifting a trembling Lily into his arms. "I'm taking her with me now." "But her school!" "She's not going to school today," David said, his voice hard as steel. "And you are not to tell Isabella you saw me. Do you understand?" Mrs. Gable nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief.
As he carried Lily to the car, she finally spoke, her voice a tiny, broken whisper against his ear. "She said you wouldn't believe me. She said you loved her more than us now. She said if I told you about the quiet game, she would break my sparrow into 100 pieces." He held her tighter, his mind reeling. The quiet game. It sounded so innocent, yet he could feel the terror it held for his daughter. He buckled her into her car seat, her small face streaked with tears. "What about Leo?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's still there with her." A fresh wave of panic washed over David. He had been so focused on Lily, he hadn't considered his son, his helpless 2-year-old son, alone in that house where the woman who used silence as a weapon. He started the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He drove not like the calm, controlled man he had always been, but like a man possessed, his only thought to get back to his house, to get to his son. The fortress he had built around his heart had been a prison for his children, and he was about to tear it down with his bare hands. David's car ate up the miles, the familiar suburban streets blurring into an unfamiliar landscape of menace. Every manicured lawn, every charming 2-story home seemed to mock him with its peaceful facade. He had chosen this neighborhood with Lena because it was safe. A place where children could ride their bikes on the sidewalk, and the biggest danger was a scraped knee. He had never imagined the real danger would be living inside his own walls, wearing a familiar face and a gentle smile. He pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel with a sound that seemed deafening in the morning quiet. He cut the engine and turned to Lily, who was huddled in her car seat, her eyes wide and fixed on the front door. "I need you to be a very brave girl for me, Lilybug," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "I'm going to go inside and get Leo. I want you to stay in the car and lock the doors. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, her small chin trembling. "Is she going to be mad at you, Daddy?" "I'm not worried about that," he said, his own anger a hard, cold knot in his stomach. "I'm only worried about you and your brother. Nothing else matters." He got out of the car, the click of the locks behind him a small, reassuring sound. He walked to the front door, and instead of using his key, he rang the doorbell. He needed to see Isabella's face when she saw him, to catch her off guard. It took a moment, and then the door opened. Isabella stood there dressed in a crisp, cream-colored blouse, a look of mild surprise on her face. "David, you're home," she said, her voice faltering for just a fraction of a second. The surprise quickly morphed into a radiant smile. "Oh, this is wonderful! But your conference, what happened?" "I finished early," he said, stepping inside. His eyes swept the immaculate foyer, then moved toward the stairs. "Where's Leo?" "He's having his nap."
she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "He was a bit fussy this morning. I thought it was best to let him rest." He started up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He didn't believe her for a second. "David, what's wrong?" Isabella called after him, her voice laced with a practiced concern. "You seem upset. Did something happen?" He ignored her, his hand already on the doorknob of Leo's room. It was locked.
A cold fury, unlike anything he had ever felt, surged through him. He rattled the knob, then banged his fist on the solid wood. "Isabella, open this door, now." "You'll wake him," she said, her voice rising in protest as she hurried up the stairs behind him. "He needs his sleep. I have him on a very strict schedule. It's important for his development." From inside the room he heard a faint whimper. Leo was awake. He had probably been awake the whole time. "Give me the key," David demanded, his voice dangerously low. Isabella's mask of serene composure finally cracked. A flicker of something hard and resentful flashed in her eyes. "I don't know what's gotten into you, David. I am only trying to help. These children were running wild after Lena. They needed structure. They needed rules." "They needed their father," David said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And I wasn't here, but I'm here now. Open the door, Isabella, or I will break it down." He meant it. Every ounce of his being was focused on the thin piece of wood that separated him from his son. Isabella saw the look in his eyes, and her face paled. With a trembling hand, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, old-fashioned key. The lock clicked, and David pushed the door open. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the morning sun. Leo was standing in his crib, his small body shaking, his face red and puffy from crying. He wasn't making loud, demanding wails, but the small, hopeless sobs of a child who had learned that no one was coming. When he saw David, his little face crumpled, and he held out his arms, a silent, desperate plea. David scooped him up, holding him tight against his chest. Leo felt too small, too light. He buried his face in his father's neck, his tiny fists clutching David's shirt. "What have you done?" David whispered, turning to face Isabella. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not the caring cousin who had saved his family, but a stranger, a woman whose eyes were cold with jealousy and resentment he had been blind to see. "I did what was necessary," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "I left them. I went off to build your precious buildings and left me to clean up the mess. They needed discipline. Lena was too soft with them. They were spoiled." "They were grieving," David said, his voice breaking. "And who was there for my grief?" she shot back, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely. "Lena was my cousin, my best friend. You think it was easy for me, living in her house, raising her children, watching you mourn her while I was just the help? I gave up my life for this family, for you." David stared at her, horrified. He saw now that her help hadn't been an act of love, but one of possession. She hadn't been trying to preserve Lena's memory. She had been trying to erase it, to replace it with her own twisted version of order and control. The clean house, the rigid schedules, the enforced silence, it was all part of her campaign to mold his children into something they were not, to break their spirits until they were as quiet and contained as she was. "Get out," he said, his voice shaking with a rage that was cold and absolute. "Get your things and get out of my house." "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. "After everything I've done! You'll be sorry, David. I'll tell everyone what an unfit father you are. They'll believe me. I'm the one who was here, the one who cared." But her threats were empty now.
The power she had held over him, the power of his own guilt and neglect, was gone. He walked past her, carrying Leo, and went downstairs. He unlocked the car door and slid Leo into the back seat next to a wide-eyed Lily. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's here. We're safe now." He went back into the house just as Isabella was coming down the stairs, a suitcase in her hand. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "You will regret this," she snarled. David just looked at her, his heart filled with a profound and terrible sadness. He had been so lost in his own grief that he had invited a monster into his home and given her his most precious treasures to destroy. "No," he said quietly, holding the door open for her. "I already do." In the days that followed Isabella's departure, the house felt both achingly empty and wonderfully full. The immaculate silence was replaced by the sounds of childhood, the clatter of wooden blocks tumbling onto the floor, Leo's happy shrieks as David chased him around the living room, and Lily's voice, slowly but surely finding its joyful register again. The house was no longer a perfect, polished model. It was a home, messy and vibrant and alive.
David canceled his trip, cleared his schedule, and for the first time in 2 years, he was simply a father. It was harder than designing a skyscraper. There were no blueprints for soothing a toddler's tantrum or for answering a 7-year-old's heartbreaking questions about why her mother had to go to heaven. He fumbled, he made mistakes, and he often felt overwhelmed. But every evening, when he tucked his children into their beds and saw the fear slowly receding from their eyes, he knew he was finally doing the most important work of his life. Mrs. Gable came more often, not as a hired helper, but as a loving surrogate grandmother. She filled the kitchen with the scent of baked apples and cinnamon, her presence a warm and steady comfort. She would sit with David in the evenings after the children were asleep, sharing stories about Lena, small, precious memories that David had locked away with his grief. "She was so proud of you, Mr. Anderson," Mrs. Gable said one evening, her knitting needles clicking softly. "But she worried. She said you built walls around your heart, even before. She said she hoped the children would be the ones to finally knock them down." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had built walls, not just of steel and glass in the city, but around his own heart, to protect himself from the pain of his loss. In doing so, he had locked his children out, leaving them vulnerable to a different kind of storm. The legal battle with Isabella was swift and brutal. Just as predicted, she hired a formidable lawyer and painted a picture of David as a wealthy, neglectful father who had abandoned his grieving children. She claimed she had been a selfless caregiver, forced to implement strict discipline to manage 2 unruly, traumatized children on her own. But David had the truth on his side. He had Mrs. Gable's quiet, unwavering testimony. He had the photos, stark and undeniable evidence of neglect. And most powerfully, he had Lily. When the time came, David asked her if she was sure she wanted to speak to the judge. Lily looked at her little brother, now a healthy, thriving toddler babbling happily in Mrs. Gable's arms, and then she looked at her father. Her small face was serious, but her eyes were clear and steady. "I have to, Daddy, for Leo." In the judge's chambers, away from the formality of the courtroom, Lily told her story. She didn't cry. Her voice was small but clear as she spoke of the quiet game, the locked doors, the gnawing hunger, and the constant fear. She spoke of her chipped sparrow, not as a broken toy, but as a broken promise. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and a deep understanding of the fragile hearts of children, listened to every word.
When Lily was finished, the judge looked at David, and he saw not accusation, but a quiet compassion. The verdict was never in doubt. David was granted full and sole custody of his children. Isabella was issued a restraining order, and the judge referred the case for criminal investigation. As they left the courthouse that day, a small crowd of reporters was waiting. But this time, David didn't hide. He held Leo in one arm and Lily's hand in the other. He stood tall, no longer a man hiding behind walls of his own making, but a father ready to protect his family. "My only statement," he said, his voice clear and strong, "is that I am grateful for a justice system that listens to the voices of children, and I am going home to be with my family." That afternoon they went into the garden. It had been Lena's sanctuary, and for 2 years it had been tended by a gardener, beautiful but impersonal. Now it was theirs. David knelt in the rich, dark earth beside his children, showing them how to gently loosen the soil around the roots of their mother's favorite roses. Lily found a small, smooth stone and placed it at the base of the largest rose bush. "For Mommy," she whispered. Leo, copying her sister, patted the dirt with his chubby hands, a smudge of soil on his nose. He looked up at David and giggled, a pure, happy sound that filled the garden. David's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sorrow, but of gratitude. He had almost lost everything, not to the cruel randomness of fate, but to his own blindness, his own fear. His children, in their quiet suffering and their incredible bravery, had saved him. They had knocked down his walls and led him back into the light. He looked at the small wooden sparrow that now sat on the kitchen windowsill, watching over them. The chip on its wing was still there, a small, imperfect reminder of the storm they had weathered. But the sparrow was still strong, and so were they. Together in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the scent of roses and damp earth, the Anderson family began to heal, their roots growing deeper and stronger in the garden their mother had loved. They were home. In the end, David learned that the strongest foundations aren't built with steel and concrete, but with love, presence, and the courage to listen. A child's small voice, speaking the truth, was powerful enough to save a family and help them heal together. And it leaves us with a question that every parent, grandparent, or caregiver must consider. How well do we truly know what happens behind closed doors when we're not there? Do you believe a parent can ever truly forgive themselves for not seeing the signs of their child's suffering sooner? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by giving it a like, a share, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. And don't forget, at Virtuous Stories, we love you.